Theodore Roosevelt stands among a group in Mino photograph. The hidden details shocks experts. Before we start, just a reminder, if you enjoy this kind of content, subscribe to the channel. Now let's get to the video. The discovery. Margaret Whitfield adjusted their wire-rimmed glasses and leaned closer to the high-resolution monitor, displaying the digitized photograph. The fluorescent lights of the Smithsonian's archival research room hummed softly overhead as she examined what appeared to be an ordinary historical photograph. The image showed a young Theodore Roosevelt, then Vice President of the United States, standing among a group of distinguished gentlemen in formal attire outside what appeared to be a government building. For weeks, Margaret had been working on digitizing and cataloging a recently donated collection of photographs from the estate of a prominent Washington, D.C. family. Most were standard political gatherings, social events, and ceremonial occasions. This particular photograph had been labeled simply as Vice President Roosevelt and Associates, September in faded ink on the back. At first glance, nothing seemed remarkable about the image. Roosevelt stood in the center, his characteristic mustache and confident posture immediately recognizable. Around him were 7 other men, all dressed in the formal black suits and top hats typical of the era. The composition was standard for political photography of the time. A formal group portrait meant to document an important meeting or event. But as Margaret increased the digital magnification to examine the photograph's details for her catalog entry, something caught her eye. In the background, partially obscured by the shadow of a building's overhang, was a figure that seemed oddly out of place. The person appeared to be wearing clothing that didn't quite match the period, and their posture suggested they were trying to remain hidden from view. Margaret rubbed her eyes, thinking perhaps the long hours were playing tricks on her vision. She had been working on this collection for 3 weeks straight, often staying late into the evening to meet her deadline. But when she looked again, the anomalous figure was still there, barely visible but undeniably present. She reached for her phone and dialed her colleague, Dr. James Morrison, a specialist in early 20th century American photography and historical authentication. James had worked with the Smithsonian for over 20 years and had an encyclopedic knowledge of presidential photography from the Roosevelt era. "James, I need you to take a look at something," Margaret said when he answered. "I'm in research room C, and I found something unusual." 20 minutes later, James arrived carrying his usual cup of coffee and wearing the slightly rumpled appearance of someone who had been buried in research all day. His gray beard was unkempt, and his tie hung loosely around his neck. "What's got you so excited, Margaret?" he asked, sitting into the chair beside her. "You sounded almost breathless on the phone." Margaret pointed to the screen. "Look at this photograph. Tell me what you see." James studied the image for several minutes, his trained eye taking in the composition, lighting, and historical context. A standard Roosevelt group portrait, probably from his vice presidential period, based on the setting and his apparent age. Good quality for the era, professional composition. "What am I missing?" "Look in the background," Margaret said, using her cursor to circle the shadowy area. "There, behind the pillar." James leaned forward, squinting at the screen. After a moment, his expression changed from casual interest to intense concentration. That's very strange. Can you enhance that section?" Margaret opened the image editing software and isolated the background area, increasing the contrast and sharpening the details. As the image became clearer, both historians fell silent. The figure in the shadows was indeed wearing clothing that appeared anachronistic, what looked like a modern business suit rather than the formal wear of night. More disturbing still, the person seemed to be holding what appeared to be a small rectangular object, pointing it toward the group. "That looks almost like," James began, then stopped himself. "Like a camera phone," Margaret finished. "I know it sounds impossible, but that's exactly what it looks like." They sat in stunned silence for several minutes, both trying to process what they were seeing. As professional historians, They were trained to approach anomalies with skepticism and to look for rational explanations. But the more they examined the image, the more difficult it became to dismiss what they were observing. "We need to verify the authenticity of this photograph," James said finally. "There could be any number of explanations: digital manipulation, a hoax, misidentification of the date or location. But we need to be absolutely certain before we draw any conclusions." Margaret nodded, her mind already racing through the authentication process they would need to follow. "I'll contact the pro bono's department and get the full history of this collection. We need to trace this photograph back to its source and verify its chain of custody." As they prepared to begin the investigation, neither historian could shake the feeling that they had stumbled upon something far more significant than a simple cataloging project. The implications of what they were seeing, if authentic, would challenge everything they thought they knew about historical photography and perhaps history itself. The next morning, Margaret arrived at the Smithsonian before dawn, her mind still reeling from the previous day's discovery. She had barely slept, her thoughts consumed by the mysterious figure in the Roosevelt photograph. As a professional historian, she knew the importance of maintaining objectivity, but she couldn't deny the excitement building within her. Her first stop was the provenance department, where she met with Dr. Elizabeth Chen, the institution's leading expert on document and photograph authentication. Elizabeth had spent 15 years developing techniques for verifying historical materials, and her reputation for thoroughness was legendary among the museum staff. "You need a complete authentication workup. On this photograph," Margaret explained, handing Elizabeth a high-resolution print of the image. "Full spectral analysis, paper dating, ink composition, everything you can do." Elizabeth examined the photograph with a magnifying glass, her expression neutral and professional. "What's the concern?" "It appears to be a standard Elementius group portrait." Margaret hesitated, knowing how her next words would sound. "There's an anomaly in the background that we need to verify, something that doesn't fit the historical period." Elizabeth said, her tone suggesting she had encountered similar claims before. "Time travel theories, anachronistic objects, that sort of thing. We get a few of these each year. Usually they turn out to be shadows, reflections, or simple misidentification." "I understand your skepticism," Margaret replied, "but I need you to examine this with fresh eyes. James Morrison and I have both looked at it extensively, and we can't explain what we're seeing." Elizabeth nodded and made the notes in her authentication log. "I'll start with the basic tests: paper composition, photographic emulsion analysis, and aging verification. If this is a modern fake or digital manipulation, those tests should reveal it immediately." While Elizabeth began her technical analysis, Margaret headed to the archives to research the photograph's provenance. The donation had come from the estate of Harrison Blackwood III, a wealthy Washington socialite whose family had been prominent in political circles since the Blackwood family papers included extensive documentation of their social and political connections, making them a valuable resource for historians studying the period. Margaret pulled the Blackwood donation files and began tracing the photograph's history. According to the state documentation, the image had been part of Harrison Blackwood Sr.'s personal collection, stored in the family's private library for over a century. The elder Blackwood had been a contemporary of Roosevelt's and had attended many political gatherings during the documentation. Seemed solid, handwritten decalogue entries dating back to the 1970s, insurance appraisals from the 1950s, and detailed inventories prepared for the estate donation. If this was a hoax, it had been in preparation for nearly a century. As Margaret delved deeper into the Blackwood papers, she discovered something intriguing. Harrison Blackwood had kept a detailed diary of his political and social activities, and there was an entry dated September 14, 1900, that mentioned attending a private meeting with Vice President Roosevelt and several other prominent figures. The diary entry read, attended most peculiar gathering with Theodore. This ocean of recent events in Buffalo most sobering. Strange incident during photography. Thought I observed someone watching from shadows who seemed out of place. Theodore appeared agitated, kept looking over shoulder. Must investigate further. Margaret's pulse quickened as she read the entry. The reference to Buffalo likely referred to the assassination of President McKinley, which had occurred on September 6, 1901. Roosevelt would become president just 8 days later, on September 2nd, making this photograph potentially one of the last images of him as vice president. But more importantly, Blackwood's diary confirmed that something unusual had been observed during the photograph session. The fact that Roosevelt himself had appeared agitated suggested that he too had noticed the mysterious figure. Margaret photographed the diary page and immediately called James. "I found corroborating evidence," she said excitedly. "Blackwood's diary mentions the same anomaly we observed. Roosevelt was apparently aware of it too." "That's impossible," James replied. "If Roosevelt had noticed someone with anachronistic technology, it would have been documented, investigated, reported in the newspapers. There's no way something like that could have been covered up. Unless," Margaret said slowly, "it was deliberately suppressed. Think about it. Roosevelt was about to become president during one of the most turbulent periods in American history. The last thing the government would want is reports of impossible occurrences or unexplained phenomena." James was quiet for a long moment. "You're suggesting a conspiracy, that the government covered up evidence of what exactly? Time travel? Time travel?" "I'm not suggesting anything yet," Margaret replied. "I'm just following the evidence. But we need to dig deeper into the historical record. If this really happened, there might be other references, other documentation that was overlooked or dismissed." As Margaret continued her research, Elizabeth Chen was conducting her technical analysis in the laboratory. Using advanced spectroscopic equipment, she examined the photograph's paper composition, ink chemistry, and photographic emulsion. Each test was designed to reveal signs of modern manufacturing or digital manipulation. The results were puzzling. The paper was consistent with early 1900s photographic stock, showing the expected aging patterns and chemical composition. The photographic emulsion matched the silver halide processes used during that period, and there were no signs of digital enhancement or modern printing techniques. But when Elizabeth examined the mysterious background figure under high magnification, she discovered something that made her question her own expertise. The figure's clothing showed textile patterns and manufacturing techniques that didn't exist in 1901, yet they were photographed using the same emulsion and lighting as the rest of the image. "This is technically impossible," Elizabeth muttered to herself as she reviewed her findings. "The entire photograph is authentic to the period, but this one figure appears to be from a different time entirely." She ran the tests again, checking for any possibility of double exposure, composite imaging, or other photographic techniques that might explain the anomaly. But every analysis confirmed the same impossible conclusion. The photograph was authentic, but it contained elements that shouldn't exist. As the day progressed, both Margaret and Elizabeth found themselves confronting evidence that challenged their understanding of history and technology. The photograph appeared to be genuine, the provenance was solid, and there was contemporary documentation supporting the existence of an anomaly. Yet the implications were so extraordinary that both women hesitated to voice their conclusions aloud. They were trained scientists and historians, committed to evidence-based research and rational analysis. But the evidence was pointing toward something that defied rational explanation. By the third day of their investigation, word of the mysterious photograph had begun to spread through the Smithsonian's research community. Dr. Robert Steinberg, the institution's director of historical research, called Margaret and James into his office for a briefing. on their findings. Steinberg was an imposing figure in his early 60s, with silver hair and the authoritative bearing of someone who had spent decades managing high-profile historical research projects. His office walls were lined with photographs of him, with various presidents, foreign dignitaries, and Nobel Prize winners, testament to the Smithsonian's role in preserving and interpreting American history. "I understand you've discovered something unusual in the Blackwood collection," Steinberg said, gesturing for them to sit in the leather chairs facing his desk. "Elizabeth Chen has briefed me on her preliminary findings, and frankly I'm concerned about the implications." Margaret and James exchanged glances before Margaret spoke. "Dr. Steinberg, we're following standard authentication procedures. We haven't drawn any conclusions yet, but the evidence is challenging to explain." "Challenging is an understatement," Steinberg replied, opening a folder containing Elizabeth's technical report. "According to this analysis, we have a photograph that is unquestionably authentic to 1901, containing an image of something that couldn't have existed in. Do you understand the position the post is the institution in?" James leaned forward. "Sir, our job is to follow the evidence wherever it leads. If we start suppressing findings because they're inconvenient or difficult to explain, we compromise our scientific integrity." Steinberg studied them both for a long moment. "I'm not suggesting suppression, but I am suggesting caution. Before we proceed any further, I want you to expand your investigation. If this photograph is what it appears to be, there may be other similar anomalies in our collections or in other institutions." He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a thick file. "I've been in contact with colleagues at the Library of Congress, the National Archives, and several university collections. I want you to examine any photographs from the Roosevelt era that might contain similar anomalies." Margaret opened the file and found a list of dozens of photographs, all from the period between 930 and "We want you to examine them systematically, using the same techniques Elizabeth Tebelis developed available for the Blackwood photograph. If this is an isolated incident, we'll deal with it accordingly. But if it's part of a pattern..." Steinberg's voice trailed off. "What aren't you telling us?" James assented, thinking there was more to Steinberg's concern than he was revealing. Steinberg hesitated, then opened another drawer and withdrew a manila envelope marked "Confidential." 3 months ago, researchers at Harvard discovered a similar anomaly in a photograph from the Lincoln assassination. A figure in the background of a Ford's the Theater photograph appeared to be wearing modern clothing and holding what looked like a digital camera. Margaret felt her breath catch. "What happened to that research?" "It was classified by the Department of Homeland Security under national security provisions. The researchers were required to sign non-disclosure agreements, and their findings were sealed." Steinberg's expression was grave. "I'm telling you this because I want you to understand the potential consequences of your investigation." James stood up abruptly. "Are you threatening us?" "I'm warning you," Steinberg replied. "If your findings confirm what Elizabeth's analysis suggests, this will no longer be a simple historical research project. It will become a matter of national security, and the decision-making will be taken out of our hands." Margaret studied the confidential file, her mind racing through the implications. "Dr. Steinberg, are you aware of other cases? Other photographs with similar anomalies?" Steinberg was quiet for a long moment before responding. "There have been incidents, always classified, always suppressed. The official position is that these are either hoaxes, misidentifications, or technical anomalies in the photographic process." "But you don't believe that," James said. "What I believe is irrelevant," Steinberg replied. "What matters is what we can prove and how we handle that proof responsibly." He stood up and walked to the window, overlooking the National Mall. "I'm giving you 1 week to complete your expanded investigation. Examine every photograph on that list, document your findings meticulously, and prepare a comprehensive report. After that, The decision about how to proceed will be made at levels far above my authority. As Margaret and James left Steinberg's office, they both felt the weight of their discovery settling upon them. What had begun as a routine cataloging project had evolved into something far more significant and potentially dangerous. "Do you think he's right about the national security implications?" Margaret asked as they walked back to the research room. "I think we're dealing with something that challenges fundamental assumptions about history and reality," James replied. "And historically, governments don't handle those kinds of challenges well. They spent the rest of the day organizing their expanded investigation. The list Steinberg had provided included photographs from Roosevelt's presidency, covering everything from White House events to public appearances and private meetings. If there were other anomalies, a systematic examination should reveal them. Margaret began with photographs from Roosevelt's first year as president, while James focused on images from his later presidency. They developed a standardized examination protocol using high-resolution scanning and the same enhancement techniques that had revealed the anomaly in the Blackwood photograph. By evening, they had examined 23 photographs without finding anything unusual. The images showed the expected historical accuracy, clothing, technology, and settings all consistent with their supposed time periods. But as Margaret loaded the 24th photograph into the scanner, she immediately noticed something that made her heart race. The image showed Roosevelt delivering a speech at a campaign rally in Minto Center Square, with a crowd of supporters gathered around a raised platform. In the crowd, barely visible among the sea of period-appropriate faces, was a figure that stood out to them. The person appeared to be a woman wearing what looked like modern business attire, and she was holding a small device that she appeared to be pointing toward the president. "James," Margaret called out, her voice tight with excitement and apprehension. "I think I found another one." As James hurried over to examine the new discovery, both historians realized that their investigation had moved far beyond academic curiosity. They were uncovering evidence of a phenomenon that, if authentic, would rewrite everything historians thought they knew about the past. And somewhere in the back of their minds, they both wondered if they were prepared for the consequences of what they might ultimately discover. The discovery of the second anomalous photograph transformed the investigation from an intriguing mystery into a systematic search for evidence. Margaret and James worked through the night, their excitement overriding their exhaustion as they methodically examined each image on Steinberg's list. By dawn, they had identified 4 additional photographs containing similar anomalies. Each image showed figures that appeared to be from different time periods, always positioned in backgrounds or crowds where they might easily be overlooked. The consistency of the pattern was both fascinating and deeply unsettling. Elizabeth Chen arrived early that morning to find them still hunched over their monitors, surrounded by printouts and technical analysis reports. "You two look like you haven't slept," she observed, setting down a tray of coffee and pastry. "We couldn't stop," Margaret said, accepting the coffee gratefully. "Elizabeth, we've found 5 more photographs with the same type of anomaly. Different dates, different locations, but the same impossible presence of anachronistic figure." Elizabeth examined the new discoveries, her scientific skepticism warring with the mounting evidence. Each photograph showed the same technical characteristics, authentic period photography containing elements that shouldn't exist. "This is beyond my expertise," she admitted after reviewing their findings. "We need to bring in specialists in temporal photography, quantum physics, maybe even theoretical physicists who work on time-related phenomena." James looked up from his analysis. "Do such specialists even exist?" "You mean outside of science fiction?" "Actually, yes," Elizabeth replied. "There's a small community of researchers who study temporal anomalies in historical documentation. Most of them work quietly, often dismissed by mainstream academics. But given what we're seeing here, maybe it's time to take their work seriously." Margaret pulled up the first photograph on her screen, the original Blackwood image that had started their investigation. "Look at this pattern," she said, pointing to the positioning of the mysterious figures. "They're always positioned where they can observe the main subjects, but where they're unlikely to be noticed by casual viewers." Almost like they're conducting surveillance, James added. But surveillance of what? And by whom? Elizabeth leaned closer to examine the images. There's something else I noticed during my technical analysis. The anachronistic figures all show slight motion blur, as if they were moving when the photographs were taken, but the rest of each image is perfectly sharp. What does that suggest? Margaret asked. It could indicate that these figures weren't entirely stable in the time period when the photographs were taken, as if they were somehow transitional. The implications of Elizabeth's observation sent a chill through the room. If the figures were indeed temporal visitors, the motion blur might indicate the difficulty of maintaining stability in a different time period. Dr. Steinberg arrived at the research room just after 9 o'clock, his expression grave as he surveyed their work. "I've been in contact with Washington overnight," he announced. "There are people who want to see your findings immediately." "What kind of people?" James asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "The kind who don't usually involve themselves in historical research," Steinberg replied. "I've been instructed to prepare a complete briefing package for a classified review this afternoon." Margaret felt a surge of protective instinct toward their research. "Steinberg, we're not finished with our analysis. We need more time to understand what we're seeing." "I understand your concern," Steinberg said, "but this is no longer entirely our decision. However, I've negotiated for you to continue your research under expanded oversight. You'll have access to additional resources, but you'll also have observers." As if summoned by his words, two individuals entered the research room. The first was a woman in her 40s, wearing a conservative business suit, with short brown hair and the alert bearing of someone accustomed to authority. The second was a man of similar age, tall and lean, with prematurely gray hair and intense blue eyes. "Dr. Whitfield Morrison," Steinberg said. "I'd like you to meet Agent Sarah Collins from the Department of Homeland Security and Dr. Michael Reeves from the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency." Agent Collins stepped forward, extending her hand. "We're here to assist with your investigation, not to interfere with it. But given the potential implications of your findings, certain protocols must be followed." Dr. Reeves nodded in agreement. "We have resources that might help explain what you're observing. DARPA has been quietly researching temporal anomalies for several years, though most of our work remains classified." Margaret and James exchanged glances, uncertain whether to feel relieved or concerned about this development. The arrival of government agents confirmed the significance of their discovery, but it also meant that their research would no longer be conducted in academic isolation. "What can you tell us about temporal anomalies?" Elizabeth Reeves, "More than you might expect," he replied. "We've documented similar phenomena in various historical contexts, though never with the clarity and consistency you've achieved here. Your photographic evidence is the most compelling we've encountered." Agent Collins opened a briefcase and withdrew a tablet computer. "We'd like to show you something that might provide context for your discoveries." She activated the tablet and displayed a series of photographs that immediately captured everyone's attention. The images showed historical scenes from various periods: Civil War, battlefields, World War, war in trenches, Depression-era breadlines, all containing figures that appear anachronistic. "We've been collecting these for over a decade," Collins explained. "Always the same pattern, observed from apparently different time periods, positioned to monitor significant historical events." James studied the images intently. "This suggests a systematic program of historical observation. But who would have the capability to conduct such surveillance across different time periods?" "That's the question we've been trying to answer," Dr. Reeves replied. "The technology required would be far beyond anything currently known to exist. We're dealing with capabilities that challenge our understanding of physics and temporal mechanics." Margaret looked up from the tablet. "Are you suggesting that someone from the future is conducting historical surveillance?" "We're not suggesting anything yet," Agent Collins said carefully. "We're gathering evidence and trying to understand the phenomenon." Your discoveries represent the most significant breakthrough we've had in this investigation. Dr. Reeves pulled out his own tablet and showed them a complex diagram. We've developed a theoretical framework for temporal observation that might explain what you're seeing. If someone had developed the ability to project consciousness or physical presence across time periods, they might be able to observe historical events without significantly altering them. But why Roosevelt, Elizabethesque? What makes his presidency so significant that it would warrant this kind of surveillance? Roosevelt was a pivotal figure in American history. Agent Collins replied, his presidency marked the beginning of America's emergence as a global superpower. The decisions made during his administration had consequences that shaped the entire 20th century. As the day progressed, Margaret and James found themselves at the center of an investigation that had expanded far beyond their original discovery. The involvement of government agencies and classified research programs suggested that their findings were part of a much larger phenomenon. But even as they gained access to additional resources and information, they couldn't shake the feeling that they were only seeing a small portion of a much more complex picture. The temporal anomalies they had discovered might be evidence of something far more significant than historical curiosity. They might be proof that history itself was being monitored and possibly influenced by forces beyond their understanding. I want to know how far this message is reached. Comment below and tell me which city or country you're watching from. The classified briefing took place in a windowless conference room deep within a government building that Margaret and James had never seen before. They had been escorted through multiple security checkpoints, their phones and personal electronics confiscated, and asked to sign documents that they weren't allowed to read completely. Around the conference table sat a collection of individuals whose presence suggested the highest levels of government interest in their discovery. In addition to Agent Collins and Reeves, there were representatives from the CIA, NSA, and what appeared to be military intelligence agencies that Margaret couldn't identify. At the head of the table sat a woman in her 60s, with silver hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected national security. She introduced herself simply as Director Harrison, without specifying which agency she represented. Dr. Whitfield, Dr. Morrison, Director Harrison began. Your research has uncovered evidence related to a phenomenon we've been investigating for over 20 years. What I'm about to share with you is classified at the highest levels, and your continued involvement in this investigation will require security clearances that few civilians possess. Margaret felt her mouth go dry. Director Harrison, we're historians, not intelligence operatives. We stumbled upon this accidentally while doing routine archival work. I understand, Harrison replied. But accidents sometimes reveal the most significant truths. Your discovery represents a breakthrough in our understanding of what we've codenamed Project Looking Glass. Reeves activated a large display screen and showed a timeline spanning from 1950 to the present day. Red markers indicated dates when temporal anomalies had been documented, and Margaret was shocked to see how many there were. We've identified over 200 instances of temporal observation across the past century and a half, Reeves explained. Always the same pattern, figures from apparently different time periods observing significant historical events. Agent Collins added, the observations seemed to focus on moments of historical transition, assassinations, declarations of war, major political decisions, technological breakthroughs, events that shaped the course of history. James studied the timeline intently. You're suggesting that someone is systematically monitoring pivotal moments in American history? Not just American history, Director Harrison corrected. We've shared intelligence with allied nations, and they've documented similar phenomena. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the Russian Revolution, the rise of Nazi Germany, all monitored by these temporal observers. Margaret's mind raced through the implication. If this is real, if someone is actually observing historical events from different time periods, then they would have knowledge of how those events turned out. They would know the consequences of historical decisions before they were made. Exactly, Harrison said, which raises the question of whether they're merely observing or whether they're influencing events to ensure specific outcomes. The room fell silent as everyone contemplated this possibility. The idea that history might be guided or manipulated by temporal observers was both fascinating and terrifying. Dr. Reeves brought up a new set of images on the screen. We've analyzed the technology that these observers appear to be using. The devices they carry show design characteristics that are decades ahead of current technology, but they follow logical evolutionary paths from existing devices. What does that tell you? Elizabeth asked. It suggests that the observers are from our future, not from an alternate timeline or different civilization. They're using advanced versions of technology that we're currently developing. Agent Collins opened a thick folder and withdrew a series of documents. 3 years ago, we made contact with someone claiming to be from one of these temporal observation missions. Margaret's eyes widened. You made contact? Someone from the future actually communicated with you? The individual approached one of our researchers at a conference on quantum physics. They provided information that allowed us to identify several temporal anomalies we had previously missed, but before we could learn more, they disappeared. Director Harrison leaned forward. The individual left behind a message that we've been trying to understand ever since. They warned us that history is more fragile than we realize, and that certain events in our near future could have catastrophic consequences if they unfold incorrectly. James felt a chill run down his spine. What kind of events? That's what we're trying to determine, Harrison replied. But the temporal observations seem to be increasing in frequency, particularly around current political and technological developments. We believe something significant is approaching, something that requires this level of historical monitoring. Graves displayed a new chart showing the frequency of temporal observations over time. Notice the pattern. Observations were relatively rare in the 19th century, increased during the World Wars, and have been accelerating rapidly since. It's almost like they're preparing for something, Margaret observed. Or trying to prevent something, Agent Collins added. The question is whether their interventions are helping or hindering the natural course of events. Director Harrison stood up and walked to a wall map, showing global locations where temporal anomalies had been documented. We've established a task force to investigate this phenomenon comprehensively. We need historians who can identify the significance of the events being observed, and we need them to have the highest security clearances. She turned back to Margaret and James. We're offering you positions on this task force. You will continue your research, but with access to classified materials and global intelligence resources. You would also be bound by security oaths that would prevent you from discussing your work with anyone outside the project. Margaret and James looked at each other, both understanding the magnitude of the decision they were being asked to make. Accepting would mean abandoning their academic careers and entering a world of classified research and government secrecy. What happens if we decline? James asked. You would be required to sign non-disclosure agreements and cease all research related to temporal anomalies. Harrison replied. Your findings would be classified, and you would return to your normal academic work. But the truth would remain hidden, Margaret said. The truth would be protected until we understand its full implications, Harrison corrected. We're dealing with forces that could destabilize society if they became public knowledge without proper context. Elizabeth spoke up for the first time during the briefing. What about the scientific community? Don't we have an obligation to share discoveries that could advance human understanding? We have a greater obligation to protect humanity from knowledge that could be used destructively, Director Harrison replied. History is full of examples of scientific discoveries that were weaponized before their beneficial applications could be developed. As the briefing concluded, Margaret and James were given 24 hours to make their decision. They would be escorted back to the Smithsonian under security supervision, and their research materials would remain under government control until they decided whether to join the classified project. Walking out of the government building, both historians felt the weight of knowledge that they couldn't share and decisions that would reshape their lives. They had uncovered evidence of something extraordinary, but that discovery had thrust them into a world where truth was measured not by scientific accuracy, but by national security implications. The question they now faced was whether the pursuit of truth was worth the sacrifice of their freedom to share that truth with the world. Margaret and James spent a sleepless night in a government-provided hotel room, their conversation circling endlessly around the impossible choice they faced. Outside their window, Washington, D.C. continued its normal rhythm, unaware that two historians were grappling with evidence that could redefine humanity's understanding of time and history. "We became historians to uncover truth and share it with the world," Margaret said, staring out at the city lights. "How can we justify burying the most significant discovery of our careers?" James sat at a small desk, reviewing the classified documents they had been allowed to take with them. "But what if sharing this truth causes more harm than good? What if the knowledge that history is being monitored or manipulated destabilizes society? And what if keeping it secret allows that manipulation to continue unchecked?" Margaret countered, "We don't know the intentions of these temporal observers. They could be trying to prevent disasters, or they could be engineering them." The weight of their decision was compounded by the realization that they were no longer dealing with abstract historical research. The temporal anomalies they had discovered suggested that powerful forces were actively involved in shaping human events, and their response to that knowledge could have consequences they couldn't predict. James pulled up the photographs on his laptop, studying the mysterious figures that had started their investigation. "Look at their positioning," he said. "They're always observing, never interfering directly. If they wanted to change history dramatically, wouldn't they take more direct action? Unless subtle observation is more effective than direct intervention." Margaret replied, "If you know how events will unfold, you might be able to influence them with minimal changes that have maximum impact." They were interrupted by a knock at their door. Agent Collins entered, carrying a briefcase and wearing the expression of someone who had spent a night reviewing classified files. "I wanted to share something with you before you make your final decision," she said, setting the briefcase on the table. "Something that might help you understand the stakes involved." She opened the briefcase and withdrew a photograph that immediately captured their attention. The image showed a modern city street, but with a timestamp indicating it was taken in 19... This photograph was taken by a CIA operative in Moscow during the height of the crisis, Collins explained. "Look carefully at the background." Margaret and James examined the image and quickly spotted the anomaly, a figure in modern dress standing near a government building, holding what appeared to be an advanced communication device. "We believe this temporal observer was monitoring the Soviet decision-making process during the crisis," Collins continued. "Our analysis suggested that certain key decisions made by Soviet leadership during those critical days were influenced by information that couldn't have been available through normal intelligence channels." James looked up from the photograph. "Are you saying that temporal observers prevented nuclear war?" "We're saying that the peaceful resolution of the Cuban Missile Crisis involved decisions that, in retrospect, seem almost impossibly well-informed," Collins replied. "Decisions that prevented what our analysts believe would have been a nuclear exchange." Margaret felt her perspective shifting as she considered the implications. If that's true, then these temporal observers might be protecting humanity from catastrophic events, or they might be ensuring that specific events occur for reasons we don't understand, Collins cautions. "The point is that we're dealing with forces that have the power to influence the course of human history. The question is whether we want to understand and potentially work with those forces, or whether we want to remain ignorant of their activities." She withdrew another document from the briefcase. "This is a communication we received yesterday from someone claiming to be a temporal observer. They're requesting a meeting." Margaret's heart raced as she read the message. It was brief and cryptic. "The historians have discovered our presence. We must speak before the convergence point. The future depends on their understanding." "A convergence point?" James asked. "What does that mean?" "We don't know," Collins admitted. But our theoretical physicists believe it might refer to a critical moment when multiple timeline possibilities intersect. A point where small changes could have enormous consequences. Margaret and James exchanged glances, both understanding that their decision had become even more complex. They weren't just choosing between academic freedom and government secrecy. They were potentially choosing whether to participate in events that could shape the future of humanity. If we join your task force, Margaret said slowly, would we have the opportunity to meet with these temporal observers? That's the plan, Collins replied. We believe your expertise in historical analysis could be crucial in understanding their activities and intention. But it would also mean accepting responsibility for knowledge that could affect the fate of civilization. James closed his laptop and looked directly at Collins. What happens if we discover that these temporal observers are manipulating history for harmful purposes? Then we would need to find ways to stop them, Collins replied without hesitation. But first, we need to understand what they're doing and why. The room fell silent as Margaret and James contemplated the magnitude of what they were being asked to undertake. They had entered this investigation as academic historians, seeking to catalog old photographs. Now they were being invited to participate in what might be the most significant undertaking in human history. We need to know one more thing, Margaret said finally. If we join this project, will we be able to maintain our integrity as historians? Will we be seeking truth, or will we be serving political agendas? Collins considered the question carefully before responding. The truth is that we don't know what we'll discover or where this investigation will lead. But I can promise you that the goal is understanding, not political manipulation. The forces we're dealing with transcend normal political consideration. Margaret stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city where so much of American history had been shaped. Somewhere in that history, temporal observers had been watching, possibly influencing events in ways that had affected millions of lives. James, she said without turning around, we became historians because we believe that understanding the past is essential for navigating the future. If there are forces actively shaping that past, don't we have an obligation to understand them? James nodded slowly. And if we don't take this opportunity, we'll spend the rest of our lives wondering what we might have learned. What we might have learned. They turned to Agent Collins simultaneously. We'll join your task force, Margaret said, but we want assurances that our research will be guided by scientific principles, not political expediency. Collins smiled for the first time since they had met her. Welcome to Project Looking Glass. I think you're going to find this investigation more extraordinary than anything you've ever imagined. As they prepared to enter a world of classified research and temporal mysteries, Margaret and James couldn't help but wonder if they were making the right choice. But they both understood that some discoveries were too significant to ignore, regardless of the personal cost. The truth about time, history, and humanity's place in the temporal landscape was waiting to be uncovered, and they were about to become part of that discovery. The meeting was arranged for a location that seemed deliberately chosen for its historical significance, the Lincoln Memorial, at midnight, 3 days after Margaret and James had officially joined Project Looking Glass. The symbolism wasn't lost on either historian. They were about to potentially meet someone from the future at a monument dedicated to a president who had preserved the Union during its greatest crisis. Agent Collins and Dr. Rivos accompanied them, along with a discreet security team positioned throughout the area. The memorial was closed to the public, but their government credentials had secured access for what was officially listed as a historical documentation project. Margaret checked her watch as they approached the steps of the memorial. 11:47 p.m. The Washington Monument stood illuminated in the distance, and the reflecting pool stretched out before them like a mirror of the night sky. Are you certain this person will show up? James asked, his voice echoing slightly in the vast space. We're not certain of anything, Dr. Reeves replied. But the communication specified this location and time, and our analysis suggests it came from the same source that has been providing us with information about temporal anomalies. As they waited, Margaret found herself studying the massive statue of Lincoln, wondering what the 16th president would think about the possibility that history was being observed and potentially influenced by visitors from the future. Lincoln had faced impossible decisions during the Civil War. Would knowledge of temporal observers have changed his approach? At exactly midnight, a figure emerged from the shadows near the base of the memorial. Margaret's breath caught as she recognized the person from the Roosevelt photographs. The same anachronistic clothing, the same careful positioning that suggested someone trying to remain unobtrusive while observing historical events. The figure approached slowly, hands visibly and empty, clearly aware of the security presence. As they drew closer, Margaret could see that it was a woman, perhaps in her 40s, with dark hair and clothing that appeared to be made from materials that didn't quite look familiar. "Whitfield, Dr. Morrison," the woman said, her voice carrying a slight accent that Margaret couldn't place. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me. I am Dr. Elena Vasquez, and I represent a research project that operates from what you would consider your future." Agent Collins stepped forward. "Dr. Vasquez, we have many questions about your activities and the temporal observations we've documented." "I'm sure you do," Vasquez replied. "But first, I need you to understand the constraints under which I operate. My presence here violates several protocols, and I can only share limited information without risking severe consequences." Dr. Reeves activated a recording device. "Can you tell us when you're from and how temporal observation is possible?" Vasquez hesitated before responding. "I'm from approximately 150 years in your future. The technology for temporal observation was developed in response to a crisis that threatened the stability of the timeline itself." Margaret felt her heart racing. "What kind of crisis?" "In the early 21st century, your current period, humanity made several decisions that created what we call a cascaded failure. Small changes in historical events began to compound, creating increasingly unstable timeline variations. Without intervention, these variations would have led to the collapse of human civilization." James leaned forward. "Are you saying that history is being changed from its original course?" "History is more fluid than you realize," Vasquez explained. "Every decision, every action creates ripples that extend far into the future. Most of these ripples are minor and self-correcting, but occasionally, changes occur that threaten the fundamental stability of the timeline." Agent Collins asked, "And your role is to prevent the destabilizing changes?" "Our role is to monitor critical junctures and, when necessary, make minimal adjustments to ensure timeline stability. We don't change history dramatically, we simply ensure that certain key events unfold in ways that preserve the overall historical trajectory." Dr. Reeves studied his tablet, which was displaying readings from various sensors. "The technology you're using, can you explain how temporal observation works?" Vasquez smiled slightly. "Your current understanding of quantum mechanics is approaching the theoretical framework necessary for temporal manipulation. What you call quantum entanglement can be extended across temporal dimensions under specific conditions." Margaret interrupted. "But why Roosevelt? Why were you observing his presidency so closely?" "Theodore Roosevelt's presidency was a critical juncture in American history," Vasquez replied. "The decisions made during his administrations established patterns of American global involvement that shaped the entire 20th century. Small changes in his policies could have led to dramatically different outcomes in both world wars." "What kind of changes?" James asked. Vasquez hesitated again, clearly weighing her words carefully. "In one timeline variation we observed, Roosevelt's conservation policies were undermined by industrial interests. The resulting environmental degradation accelerated climate change by several decades, leading to global conflicts over resources that devastated human civilization." The implications of her statement sent a chill through the group. The idea that small policy changes could have such far-reaching consequences was both fascinating and terrifying. "Are there other temporal observation teams?" Agent Collins asked. "Several," Vasquez confirmed. We focus on American history because changes in American policy have had global implications throughout the modern era. Other teams monitor different regions and time periods. Dr. Reeves looked up from his readings. Our sensors are detecting some kind of temporal distortion around you. Is that normal? Temporal observation requires maintaining a partial connection to our original time period. Vasquez explained. This creates what you might call temporal instability. I can only maintain al picomenes que contiken takentipia oxanfoqueria. Margaret Truntino. Margaret senza por emorio y ampotorito bicomechon bulaños. Margaret senza por emorio y amorio ni amidicomechonquino. Vasquez's expression became grave. The next 20 years will be critical for human civilization. Decisions about artificial intelligence, climate change, and global cooperation will determine whether humanity survives and thrives or faces catastrophic decline. Are you observing current events, James Porfic, while monitoring several critical junctures in your immediate future? But our ability to intervene is limited by the risk of creating paradoxes that could destabilize the entire timeline. Agent Collins leaned forward. What do you need from us?
We need you to understand that history is not fixed, Vasquez replied. The choices your generation makes will determine the future of my generation Iruridas. Your research on the temporal anomalies has given you knowledge that will be crucial in ensuring positive outcomes. She reached into her clothing and withdrew a small device that appeared to be made of materials that shifted and changed as Margaret watched.
To happens information about critical decision points in your near future. Use it wisely. Dr. Reeves reached for the device, but Vasquez pulled it back. This information comes with enormous responsibility. Knowledge of future events can be as dangerous as it is beneficial. Margaret stepped forward. Dr. Vasquez, if we accept this responsibility, how will we know if we're making the right choices? You won't, Vasquez replied simply. That's the nature free will and historical causation. Pero Josué Lunterlandem historical patterns, and consequences, gives you better judgment than most audio. The temporal distortion around Vasquez was becoming more pronounced, and her images seemed to flicker slightly. I must return soon. Will you accept the responsibility of this knowledge? Margaret and James, Luco habías y todo había malion obtander, en la esencia no había tu disinformación de decisión, mi afecfidi no vunati con via por ma civilización, disinformación de sidone volan recanga. Via pilceptori gana el por le vinojo nor de bilda. Via bonit going von die jupinte de tours, e la pormagen ubicac, Tropante mestori cavias, wabia. Look for patterns, understand consequences, and remember that small changes can have enormous impacts. As she began to fade, becoming increasingly translucent, Vasquez offered more final piece of advice. The future is not predetermined. Every choice you make creates new possibilities. Choose wisely. With that you disappeared entirely, leaving only a slight distortion in the air that quickly dissipated. The core team members stood in stunned silence, processing what they had just experienced. Margaret looked down at the device in her hands, realizing that she was holding information about humanity's future, information that came with the responsibility to help shape that future. Well, Agent Collins said finally, I think our investigation just became significantly more complex. Hasta Bayos prepared to leave the Lincoln Memorial. Margaret couldn't help but look back at the statue of the president who had preserved the Union during this greatest crisis. Now she and her colleagues faced a different kind of crisis, the responsibility of using knowledge from the future to help ensure to humanity who had a future worth inheriting. 6 months after their encounter with Dr. Vasquez, Margaret and James found themselves in a secure facility outside Washington, D.C., surrounded by a most advanced temporal research equipment con human technology no probabilidad. The device Vasquez ardeidonak von gaon to theory analyzed, at perfigoutly gathered, revealing fragments of information about critical decision points in the near future. The Project Looking Glass team had expanded to include physicists, computer scientists, political analysts, and experts in artificial intelligence. Quatad Wigunas as historical investigation, envolved Community's first systematic attempt to understand and work with temporal observation technology. Margaret stood before a wall-sized display showing a complex timeline of potential future events. Red markers indicated critical contours, where small changes could have enormous consequences, while green markers showed stable decision points that were unlikely to create timeline disruptions. The pattern is becoming clearer, Shafam de Assemble Timpe. The temporal observers are trying to control history, they're trying to prevent catastrophic timeline collapses that could erase human civilization entirely. Dr. Reeves nodded from his position at a bank of computers. Analysis of the Vasquez device confirms that timeline stability is more fragile than we ever imagined. Small changes in key historical moments can create cascade effects that compound over decades. James contemplated a cluster of red markers centered around the Melchizedek period. Look at this concentration of critical junctures. It's as if we're approaching a convergence point where multiple timeline possibilities intersect. Agent Collins, now the official liaison between Project Looking Glass and the highest levels of government, studied the display intently. What kinds of decisions are we talking about? What choices could have such far-reaching consequences? Margaret activated a detailed view of the near-future timeline. Acuerde que información will be farmetestado en Vasquez device. The critical decisions involve artificial intelligence development and climate change response in international cooperation on global challenges. The choices made in the next 10 years will determine whether humanity enters a period of unprecedented prosperity or faces civilizational collapse. Elizabeth Chen, como projected leading expert on temporal technology, looked up from her analysis station. We've always discovered something else. The temporal observation technology appears to be creating a feedback loop. The more we study the future, the more we influence it. What do you mean? Dr. Reeves asked. Every time we access information from Vasquez's device, we create small changes in our decision-making processes. Those changes ripple forward. Alteria ver futuro entromituari a lo spelf. The implications of Elizabeth's discovery sent a chill through the room. They were not passive observers of the futuro. They were active participants on shaping it, whether they intended to be or not. Margaret walked to the window overlooking the facility's grounds, where teams of researchers worked around the clock to understand the temporal phenomena they had uncovered. We've been thinking about this wrong, Chesuleting. We've been treating the temporal observers as external forces influencing our timeline, para quando vivirá un parto del sistema. Gemsi o tuand have la melinudo. What do you mean? What if our discovery of the temporal anomalies wasn't accidental? What if it was part of a larger pattern designed to ensure that humanity develops the knowledge and responsibility necessary to manage timeline stability? Agent Collins considera que es posibilito, y José Chestecado our entire investigimos no corkstram dado papela esaf. Entire investigimos complexen flu complexen bawerraies, Margaret replied. If the future can influence the past, then our discovery of temporal observation, Margaret replied, was consequencent a complied the camwistramd. Reves Bruno no display showing the mathematical models they had developed to understand temporal causation. Margaret might be right. Our models suggest that stable timelines require conscious participation for multiple time periods. The future can only be preserved if the past understands its role in creating the future. Elizabeth activated the Vasquez device, which had been integrated into their computer systems, when analyzing the deeper layers of information in the device. There's something here that suggests that temporal observation project in Vasquez time was itself Vasquez time, knowledge received of event further in the future. A temporal chain of knowledge, James Sam, understanding the implication immediately. Each generation receives information from the future and uses it to ensure the future comes to pass. Margaret felt a huevo con responsibility to physical variedad to cueca verariambota por alma. Pibio, di piempete estoyo de camarada, pentamoko renanza na security de camo, yatin Collins sabirienos aden estudavaron long for son kicho. As St. Collins activated her secure communication device, I need to brief the President and the National Security Council. If we're dealing with a system of temporal causation que estén sacros en cieneris, the implications for policy making are staggering. As Collins left to make her calls, the remaining team members contemplate the magnitude of what they had discovered. They were not just historians and scientists studying an interesting phenomenon. They were guardians of humanity's future, entrusted with knowledge that could preserve or destroy human civilization. The question now, Dr. side, is how we use this knowledge responsibly. How we make decisions to the future. When we know I supercorpoidnice, when we know a Dios des knowledges, when we know a Dios des knowledge ripple across centuries. Margaret then back to the timeline display, studium the critical hunkor. Margaret then back to the timeline display, studium the critical hunkor, the lay ahead. We start by understanding that we're not making this decision alone, she said. We're part of a chain of knowledge and responsibility that connects past and future. What your job is to be guardians como caballos estúpido proco.
I has identified 3 immediate decision points, where our knowledge could make a critical difference. The first involves artificial intelligence safety protocols that are currently being debated in Congress. The second relates to international climate agreements being negotiated next month.
De concern space exploration funding que lo determina de bounty o montaje species multiplanetary species. Come study the data carefully. Each of these decisions seems relatively minor in isolation, but according to the temporal models, they're interconnected in ways that could determine the trajectory of man's civilization. That's exactly right, Margaret replied. The temporal observers are concerned with individual events, the minor within no complex web of causation that connects seemingly unrelated decisions across time. Dr. Reeves pulled up a communication that arrived through secure channels. We've received another message from the temporal observation team. They're requesting a second meeting. Margaret felt her pulse quicken. What do they want to discuss? According to the messages, we've reached a decision threshold. Decisions and the choices made in the next 6 months will determine which of several possible futures becomes reality. Again Collins returned when her briefing calls, her expression grave. The President has authorized full cooperation with the Temporal Observation Project. We have unlimited resources and authority to take whatever actions are necessary to ensure positive timeline outcomes. That's both encouraging and terrifying, Himes observed. The power to influence the future of human civilization is not something any group should wield lightly. Margaret nodded in agreement. Which is why we need to establish protocols for how we use this knowledge. We need ethical guidelines, oversight mechanisms, and safeguards against the temptation to play God with history. Elizabeth activated a new display showing the facility's expanded research capabilities. We've been authorized to build a permanent and temporal research center. The goal is to establish ongoing communication and future observation teams and develop our own temporal monitoring capabilities. Our own temporal monitoring, that we might be able to develop limited temporal observation capabilities that would allow us to monitor the consequences of our decisions in real time. Margaret considered the implications of this development. If we can observe the immediate future consequences of our choices, we could make more informed decisions about critical junctures. That we would also be creating a new level of temporal complexity, Hams cautioned. The more we observe the future, the more we change it. We could end up trapped in an endless loop of observation and adjustment. Agent Collins brought up a classified document on her tablet. There's something else you need to know. We're not the only ones who have discovered temporal anomalies. Intelligence agencies in several other countries have reported similar findings. Are they cooperating with temporal observers as well? Margaret asked. We don't know, Collins replied. The impossibility of competing temporal observation projects results on as timeline stability. If different groups are trained to influence the future in different directions, the results could be catastrophic. Dr. Reeves looked up from his calculations. The mathematical models suggest that timeline stability requires coordination between all temporal observation efforts. Competing interventions could create paradoxes that destabilize the entire temporal framework. Margaret felt the weight of responsibility growing heavier. Norium faidu, yarbado dima bonabenugutia futir, but noje bosh humanil knowledge, y corundita dima bonafodilegram, yarmestuma monamentu camoretic to boyobu. Tenot soy akechi wabitu rubid mafiom, but it's an efadio falcope temporo les avantus poches to malbac. Omunisado bomen, prefer for terbigal, trufidosa que pipa te quiere vir observasme. And we know si be prepared to make decisions que could affect the future human civilization. Como lividaciono, iso punus pod, que no properdos tapados, quero es na que no past, present, pod, en avutoa, que en se abre past, present, postora. Iso complex web of causacho, cabotrid, un estopeneg, anda la que tam dado volvoz, como livir, un odontre past que tam dado. No de understood avotiendo lo Rooseveltom en habiat la note some la cishor, temporal observación and deparal observación de influencen. De decisión si menos presidenta, avión gondi, avoti ampolo del por diobot, pues da homin predigondi. Y now was de roturna, y coñante mitar de la razón possibility forward. To billeto lo flonio obedeción con aquito di forward de movien todo tipo en tac, torio bis partiturna. Is comunicada de Spaxon, que está un possibility forward, por no digom, y tu con aquito tibot que tu varida no ciento la que es un uso camentivodor que un combino de double lepsom. Margaret en guialor jalogues, a de poriborbi que na que no creable el gel. Conscious choice, a the momento con pioquis responsibility, Virginia be well with forcing me but in the decision de que ni vencer vivo the rest of their lives. As she prepared to leave the facility for the evening, Margaret looked once more at the timeline display. Somewhere in that complex web of possibilities lay the future that humanity would inherit. Their job was to help ensure that it was a future worth inheriting. The hidden detail in the 1901 photograph had revealed more than just evidence of temporal observation. It had revealed humanity's role as conscious participants in the creation of their own destiny. Yet the revelation would change everything about how they understood history, the future, in the place in the vast tapestry of time. In the end, the most shocking discovery was not eco future was quite in past, but the past and future were partners in creating a timeline que could preserve and protect human civilization across the centuries. Y la responsibility was enormose, but also the opportunity que tu afford humanity cuando bunto creates potential. The investigation a que cada vagón, with a simple photograph, had become humanity power others conscious participast in the flow of time itself. And Margaret no, aticos adun pirene y todo su siro en deradinia un toque var span generation, en resei por humanity's understanding the replesa de universal.